Evan Calder spent 18 years saving airplanes that nobody remembered his name for. Then, in one cold meeting, the leadership of Harrington Aeronautics replaced the widowed single father with 3 celebrated experts and called him a relic of the old ways. Evan said nothing. He simply packed his tools into a cardboard box and walked out through the side door he had used for nearly 2 decades. Weeks later, the company's billion-dollar aircraft failed catastrophically right before the demonstration that would decide its future. The 3 new experts opened the emergency files and went pale. Every method they knew, every instinct that had made them famous, carried the fingerprints of the very man they had just watched get thrown away. The testing floor at Harrington Aeronautics smelled of ozone and cold metal. On the morning the Asterion prototype was scheduled for its first full systems run. Dozens of engineers sat behind glass, eyes fixed on monitors that scrolled numbers faster than any human could read, while overhead lights hummed in a frequency that made the whole hangar feel like the inside of a held breath. Nobody noticed the small flicker in the battery cooling readout except one man standing near the back, arms crossed, watching not the screen but the machine itself. Evan Calder had learned long ago that airplanes rarely announced their problems loudly. They whispered first, in a fraction of a degree, in a valve that closed a heartbeat too slow, in a vibration sensor reporting numbers that were simply too smooth to be real. He asked for the test to stop. Roderick Wexford, the company's chief operating officer, made no effort to hide his irritation, since every hour of delay cost the company a small fortune in wasted fuel and idle staff. Evan did not raise his voice or argue with feeling. He laid out 3 facts that on their own seemed like nothing at all. The battery temperature was climbing slower than the model predicted. The cooling valve was responding a fraction of a second late, and a vibration sensor was returning numbers so stable they bordered on impossible. Taken together, those 3 small oddities pointed to only one explanation: that a failing sensor was flattening its own data to hide a fault underneath it. When the technicians finally cracked open the sensor housing, they found a hairline fracture running through the connector, the kind of defect that would have quietly reported a cooler temperature than the battery actually held. Evan had just prevented a disaster nobody else in the building had even suspected. In the official incident log, Roderick described the delay simply as an instance of excessive caution from the reliability team. At home that evening, Evan's life looked nothing like the tense glass corridors of Harrington Aeronautics. He lived in a modest 2-story house, with a lawn he mowed himself and a kitchen where he cooked simple dinners most nights. Phone propped against the sugar jar so he could video call his daughter while the pasta boiled. Maeve was 20 now, studying industrial design 3 states away, and their calls had become the quiet anchor of his week. In the garage behind the house, long after the dinner dishes were dried and put away, Evan sat down at a desk, crowded with second-hand monitors, and ran something the company had no idea existed. Under a voice modulation program and a username nobody at Harrington had ever heard, Evan taught an online engineering fellowship called North Star Reliability, where hundreds of aviation and systems specialists around the world had learned not to memorize procedures but to distrust their own certainty. He never gave his students clean, textbook problems with obvious answers. He handed them broken systems with contradictory evidence and made them sit with the discomfort of not knowing, because in his experience, the engineers who caused catastrophic failures were rarely the ones who lacked knowledge. They were the ones who trusted a model more than they trusted their own doubt. Inside the fellowship, behind a call sign that concealed everything about who he was, Evan Calder was known simply as North Star 1. One night, Maeve asked him gently why he never told anyone at work that he ran the fellowship, since surely it would earn him some respect at a company that seemed to overlook him constantly. Evan considered the question for a long moment before answering that what mattered was whether his students could save a failing system when the pressure was on, not whether they could recite the name of the man who taught them. The next morning, without Evan's knowledge, Roderick sent Celeste Harrington an internal memo describing him as a knowledgeable but outdated employee, someone who leaned too heavily on personal instinct and did not fit the company's push toward modernization. Attached to that memo were 3 names Roderick proposed as replacements, 3 specialists whose credentials gleamed on paper in a way Evans never had. When Evan later saw those names scrawled at the bottom of a printed page, left carelessly on a conference table, something in his chest tightened because he recognized every one of them from a very different set of files entirely. Evan was summoned to the top-floor conference room 2 days later, where Celeste Harrington sat at the head of a long glass table flanked by Roderick and a human resources representative who kept her eyes fixed on a folder rather than on Evan's face. Celeste explained, in careful and rehearsed language, that the reliability division for the Asterion program was being restructured, and that 3 new specialists would be taking over the responsibilities Evan had carried alone for so many years. Lena Whitaker would lead systems integration, Marcus Bellamy would oversee propulsion diagnostics, and Jonah Vance would handle software safety architecture, and Roderick called them the next generation of experts, professionals with international reputations rather than a man known only inside the walls of one company. Evan did not object to the hiring of any of the 3 because he had read enough of their published work over the years to know they were genuinely talented people. What troubled him was that nobody in the room had thought to ask why 3 specialists trained at different institutions on different continents approached engineering problems with an almost identical philosophy, or who had shaped the thinking that made them so effective in the first place. Celeste offered Evan a face-saving option, a transfer to a documentation advisory role for 6 months before a quiet retirement, a position stripped of any authority to halt a test or speak directly to the engineering floor. Evan understood immediately that this was simply a slower, gentler way of pushing him out the door without anyone having to say the word fired out loud. He asked, calmly, whether this decision had anything to do with his refusal to approve the plan to shorten the battery testing cycle several months earlier. Roderick denied it flatly, insisting the decision was purely about adaptability and the company's need to modernize its approach to reliability engineering. Evan did not plead his case or raise his voice, but he asked for one thing before he left the room, that the record reflect clearly he had never approved any reduction of the battery system's testing protocol. Celeste told him she understood how difficult this must feel, but that no company could responsibly depend on a single individual for something as critical as flight safety. Evan agreed with her completely, and told her so, adding only that the most dangerous system of all was not one that depended on a single person, but one that removed the only person willing to say it was wrong. He declined the advisory position and accepted the severance package instead, choosing to leave entirely rather than linger as a diminished version of himself inside a building he had helped keep safe for nearly 2 decades. He returned to the engineering floor to collect a chipped coffee mug, a few worn notebooks filled with his own shorthand, and a photograph of Maeve from her high school graduation, leaving every scrap of company data exactly where it belonged. Arden Pike, the quality control director who had worked beside Evan for years, could not bring himself to meet his eyes as he passed, and neither could most of the engineers who owed more to Evan's quiet mentorship than they would ever admit aloud. Evan paused for just a moment beside the half-assembled Asterion frame, close enough to touch the fuselage, but he did not turn back for a second look before walking out through the same side door he always used. That same afternoon, Lena, Marcus and Jonah arrived at Harrington Aeronautics to a wave of photographers, glossy internal newsletters, and a stage-managed welcome that framed them as the team who would carry the company into its future. Not one person in that celebration mentioned the name of the man who had just walked out carrying a cardboard box or told the 3 new arrivals whose desk they were now occupying. Within their first week, the 3 specialists were granted full authority over every safety evaluation tied to the Asterion program, inheriting binders upon binders of documentation that Roderick described, with a dismissive wave of his hand, as disorganized and overly cautious. He told them privately that the previous engineer had refused to standardize his methods, routinely delayed critical testing, distrusted modern simulation technology, and resisted every attempt at progress out of fear for his own position. At first, all three believed him, since there was no reason yet to doubt the man who had just handed them extraordinary authority and an enormous budget. But as they began working through the actual files, a very different picture started to emerge from beneath Roderick's dismissive summary. The fault detection architecture underlying the entire Asterion reliability system was organized with a precision that none of them had expected. Layered with verification checks, they had assumed belonged to some cutting-edge modern software suite. Instead, those layers had been designed years earlier by the very man Roderick had just described as outdated. Built not from expensive tools, but from patient, iterative thinking about how systems failed in the real world. Lena noticed that every diagnostic table followed a principle she recognized instantly from another part of her life entirely, a principle that told her never to search for the single largest anomaly, but to look instead for three small deviations arriving together. Marcus found a propulsion diagnostic sequence that mirrored, almost exactly, an exercise he had once completed during the hardest stretch of training in his career. Jonah discovered something even more startling, a handwritten note in the margin of an old file that read, simply that data does not lie. But the person who selects the data certainly can. That single sentence stopped Jonah cold, because it was a phrase he had heard spoken aloud, in a modulated voice, inside a private online fellowship years before he ever set foot inside Harrington Aeronautics. All three began to quietly suspect that the departed engineer might have some connection to the very program that had shaped their careers, though none of them dared say it out loud just yet. When they asked Arden Pike whether he knew anything about Evan's background beyond his job title, he offered only that Evan had been at the company since before most of the current engineering staff had even been hired. Roderick, sensing the direction of their curiosity, quickly redirected them, insisting they focus their energy on finishing what Evan had supposedly left incomplete rather than digging into the personal history of a man who no longer worked there. Meanwhile, Evan quietly began repairing industrial systems for a small independent workshop across town, taking on contract work that paid modestly but kept his hands busy. And he continued his nighttime sessions with the fellowship exactly as before. Maeve, during one of their calls, gently suggested that he simply tell the three new hires who he really was, since it seemed absurd for him to stay silent while they scrambled to rebuild something he had already built once. Evan refused, explaining that he did not want to turn their genuine accomplishments into a tool for reclaiming his old position, because their skill belonged to them, regardless of who'd once guided them toward it. Back at Harrington, the new team completed a full simulation cycle without uncovering any major faults, and Roderick immediately pushed to move the public demonstration 2 full weeks ahead of schedule. Lena objected, arguing that the physical testing data was still too thin to justify accelerating anything. But Roderick reminded her sharply that she had been hired to move faster than her predecessor. Not to repeat his caution, the pressure of that single sentence settled uneasily over all three of them, because it was becoming clear that they had not simply been hired to replace an engineer. They had been brought in, at least in part, to lend their reputations to a decision that leadership had already made, long before their arrival, using 3 respected names to make a dangerous shortcut look like scientific progress. During one later test run, the system produced exactly the kind of deviation Evan had once warned about in an internal memo, but when Lena went searching for that original warning, the entire report had vanished from the shared archive without explanation. Lena requested Evan's complete personnel file, hoping to understand the full scope of what he had once flagged, but the records department produced only a heavily condensed version, with entire sections missing. Every reference to the faulty sensor batch and the original testing limits Evan had insisted upon had simply disappeared from the official record. Arden finally admitted, in a quiet conversation away from cameras and open doors, that Roderick had personally instructed him to soften certain reports so as not to alarm the company's investors. Arden had not destroyed the original data outright, but he had moved it into an archive that the current project team could not easily access. It was Marcus who, eventually located that hidden archive. And what the three of them found inside made their stomachs turn. 6 months before his removal, Evan had warned in writing that a new batch of sensors carried unstable margins of error, that the supplier had not completed proper cross-verification, and that the cooling system could misread its own data under high-load conditions. He had also warned that the automated software could not reliably distinguish between a sensor that was simply stable and one that had silently failed, and he had recommended 3 additional rounds of ground testing before the aircraft went anywhere near a public demonstration. At the bottom of that very report sat Roderick's own signature, rejecting every one of Evan's recommendations without explanation. Marcus cross-referenced the purchasing records and discovered the questionable sensor batch had come from a company called Wexford Advanced Components, an investment firm with clear ties to Roderick's own family. The price had been lower than the previously approved supplier, and the contract had been quietly justified in the books as a simple cost-saving measure. Lena began to understand, with a mixture of anger and grief, that Evan had not been pushed out for being outdated at all. He had been pushed out because he refused to put his signature on a system built with components nobody had properly verified. The three of them tried calling Evan directly through the numbers listed in his old employee file, but he did not answer a single call originating from Harrington Aeronautics. Jonah, remembering something from his own past, decided instead to send a message using a phrase that had once served as a private code inside the fellowship, a question about 3 clocks that all displayed the same wrong time. Evan's reply arrived within minutes, stating simply that he would look for whoever had adjusted all 3 clocks rather than trusting the hour they showed. The 3 specialists sat in stunned silence, because that exact answer, word for word, had once been given by North Star 1 during the final session of their training. They arranged to meet Evan quietly at a small diner near the airport, and the moment they heard his real voice and watched him sketch a failure diagram on a paper napkin with the same economical strokes they remembered, all doubt disappeared. Evan Calder was North Star 1, the anonymous mentor who had shaped each of their careers at some of the lowest points in their professional lives. Lena asked why he had said nothing during the meeting where he was replaced by the very people he had trained. Evan answered simply that all 3 of them had been hired on the strength of their own hard-earned ability, and he had no interest in claiming ownership over what they had built for themselves. Marcus told him they did not need credit for their success, but that the company had used their reputations to publicly humiliate the man who had made that success possible in the first place. Evan asked them not to quit out of loyalty to him, reminding them that their responsibility now was to the project and to the truth, not to any sense of personal debt they felt they owed him. Before they parted ways that evening, he gave them one final warning, telling them that the danger he had flagged in that old report was not even the most serious risk buried inside the Asterion system. The greatest threat, he said, lived inside the automated backup power transfer, a system that could hesitate at exactly the wrong moment if it ever received corrupted data from a failing sensor. Working quietly and without informing Roderick, the 3 engineers tested Evan's warning and confirmed his fears almost immediately. When the temperature sensor transmitted false readings, the software could be fooled into believing the primary system remained perfectly safe, delaying the switch to backup power by several critical seconds. Under normal conditions, those seconds meant nothing at all, but under peak load, they were more than enough time for the battery to cross a threshold it should never approach. Jonah discovered that the software had not been flawed in its original design, since Roderick himself had ordered the removal of a manual verification layer to speed up the aircraft's startup sequence. That verification layer, as it turned out, had been one of Evan's original safeguards, dismissed by Roderick as an old engineer's overly sentimental habit. Lena drafted an urgent request to delay the demonstration, but Roderick refused outright, reminding her that Harrington was preparing to close a major investment agreement with Blackthorn Sovereign Capital immediately following the event. A delay now, he warned, could cost the company hundreds of millions of dollars in lost valuation, a threat he delivered with the calm efficiency of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Celeste, still unaware of the brewing crisis, received only a brief summary from Roderick describing the issue as a minor software matter that had already been fully resolved. Believing him completely, she authorized the demonstration to proceed exactly as scheduled. Behind closed doors, the three engineers argued over what to do next, with Marcus pushing to expose everything immediately, while Lena worried that without airtight proof, Roderick would simply dismiss the entire con and quietly replace them with someone more compliant. Jonah suggested they borrow directly from Evan's own teaching philosophy, choosing not to attack Roderick with accusations, but instead designing a test that would force the system to prove its own instability beyond any argument. They built a controlled dual-load simulation, and the results confirmed exactly what they feared, that the power transfer delay exceeded every acceptable safety margin by a wide and dangerous margin. Within minutes of the test concluding, the recorded data was mysteriously overwritten by an automated system process, a clear sign that someone outside their own team was monitoring the lab in real time. Arden later admitted, with visible shame, that Roderick had granted remote access to an external executive group without informing anyone on the engineering staff. The three specialists managed to preserve a secure backup copy before it disappeared entirely, and they sent it directly to Celeste, bypassing Roderick altogether for the first time. At almost the exact same moment, Roderick discovered that the three of them had secretly met with Evan, and he accused his former employee of illegally interfering with a project he no longer had any legal claim to. Evan responded with characteristic calm, pointing out that he had received no proprietary data whatsoever, and that every observation he made was grounded in general safety principles and questions his former students had asked on their own initiative. Unable to attack Evan on legal grounds, Roderick shifted his strategy toward destroying his reputation instead, announcing internally that Evan had secretly trained outside specialists during his years of employment and may have violated conflict of interest policy in doing so. Maeve, digging through old family paperwork, out of simple curiosity, found a forgotten contract proving that Harrington Aeronautics itself had once financially sponsored the North Star Fellowship years earlier. Evan's name, she discovered, had been quietly stripped from every later version of that document following an internal corporate restructuring. The person who had approved the removal of Evan's name from that sponsorship record, buried deep in a signature line nobody had bothered to check in years, was none other than Roderick Wexford himself. Celeste called an emergency meeting the moment she received the preserved test data, summoning Roderick and all three engineers into the same glass conference room where Evan had once been quietly dismissed. Lena walked the room through the simulation results in careful, methodical detail, but Roderick dismissed the entire test as artificial, staged under conditions that bore no resemblance to real-world flight. He accused all three specialists of allowing personal gratitude toward a former mentor to cloud their professional judgment, a claim that landed with an uncomfortable silence rather than agreement. It was in that very meeting that Celeste learned, for the first time, that the man she had quietly pushed out of her own company was the same anonymous mentor who had trained three of the industry's most promising young engineers. She demanded an independent verification of the test results, but the clock was working against her. Since the agreement with Blackthorn Sovereign Capital was set to close in only 2 days, and canceling the demonstration risked breaching commitments already made to the investors, Roderick proposed a compromise designed to look responsible, while changing almost nothing of substance, suggesting the aircraft skip an actual flight and instead perform a ground-based engine and electrical test, with load kept at what he called a conservative safety margin. Investors would still be allowed to observe from the control center, and the event could still be presented publicly as proof the program remained on schedule. The three engineers objected strongly, warning that even a grounded aircraft could overheat catastrophically if the same faulty sensor batch remained installed. Celeste, caught between mounting technical warnings and enormous financial pressure, made a decision that surprised almost everyone in the room. She picked up the phone and called Evan Calder herself, asking him to return in a temporary advisory capacity for the remainder of the demonstration process. Evan refused immediately, if his role amounted to nothing more than a convenient shield, allowing leadership to proceed with a plan he had already warned them against. He offered instead 4 conditions before he would even consider returning: that every technical warning be formally recorded in the official meeting minutes, that he retain full authority to halt any test without needing prior approval, that the sensor supplier contract undergo a fully independent investigation, and that no employee ever face retaliation for raising a legitimate safety concern. Roderick argued furiously that a man who no longer worked for the company had no standing whatsoever to dictate terms on a billion-dollar program. Celeste agreed to the first 3 conditions without hesitation, but hesitated visibly over the 4th, since a full investigation into the supplier contract would inevitably expose her own family friend and chief operating officer. Evan held firm and refused to budge, and to Roderick's visible shock, all 3 specialists announced in that same meeting that they too would refuse to certify the aircraft as safe without those same protections in place. For the first time since the crisis began, Roderick lost control of the room entirely, threatening to replace all 3 engineers with an internal team that would simply follow his instructions without argument. Marcus answered him calmly, pointing out that replacing expertise with obedience was the exact same mistake the company had already made once before with Evan, and it had nearly destroyed the entire program. Celeste, watching her chief operating officer publicly unravel in front of the very engineers he had once championed, finally agreed to every one of Evan's conditions in full. Evan returned to Harrington Aeronautics, not through the polished front lobby, with its gleaming glass walls, but through the same worn technical entrance he had used for 18 years, drawing quiet, uncertain stares from employees who no longer knew how to greet him. He showed no interest in ceremony or recognition, moving instead directly to inspect every connection point, every recent software patch, and every layer of the backup power system with the same patient thoroughness he always brought to his work. Behind his back, Roderick quietly ordered that the unverified Wexford sensor batch remain installed in the aircraft, reasoning privately that replacing it now would cause an unacceptable delay to the demonstration. Arden overheard that order through a half-closed office door and, without saying a word to anyone, recorded it carefully for what he now understood might become important evidence. Just minutes before the ground test was scheduled to begin, Evan noticed something small but deeply troubling: that the serial numbers on the installed sensors did not match the batch the engineering team believed had already passed inspection. Evan demanded the technical compartment be opened immediately, and the discrepancy was confirmed. Within moments, the sensors currently installed were not the ones his team believed they were testing at all. Roderick claimed weakly that an equivalent batch had simply been substituted due to a temporary shortage of the approved parts, though no documentation existed anywhere proving those substitute sensors had ever passed verification. Celeste, furious and increasingly desperate, ordered the test halted immediately. But by then the Blackthorn Sovereign Capital representatives had already arrived, and reporters were gathering just outside the building. Roderick pressed the board hard, warning that stopping the event now could cost the company its most important investment deal and put thousands of jobs at risk across every department. Some board members, rattled by the scale of that warning, began to visibly waver toward supporting Roderick rather than the growing chorus of safety concerns. Evan refused to argue about money at all. Instead, he asked the 3 engineers to run one simple, direct test in front of everyone present, heating each installed sensor to an identical temperature and comparing how quickly each one responded. 2 of the sensors reacted exactly as expected, their readings climbing smoothly and predictably with the rising heat. The 3rd sensor held perfectly still for nearly 4 full seconds before suddenly jumping upward, exactly the failure pattern Evan had warned about in his very first report months earlier. Roderick still insisted the software's compensation layer could account for exactly this kind of delay, but Jonah calmly informed the room that the compensation layer had been disabled in the most recent software update, an update approved and signed off entirely by the Chief Operating Officer's own office. The evidence in the room was now pointing directly and unmistakably at Roderick himself. He argued weakly that the power transfer delay remained purely theoretical and had never actually been proven under real operating conditions, so Evan proposed reproducing the fault inside a fully controlled environment without engaging the aircraft's main engines at all. The resulting simulation confirmed everything at once, that the sensor transmitted false data, that the software believed the system remained perfectly stable, that the backup power failed to activate at the necessary moment, that heat accumulated far faster than any existing model predicted, and that the emergency shutdown mechanism responded far too slowly to prevent serious damage. Celeste asked, her voice tight with disbelief, why none of the earlier models had ever caught a fault this dangerous. Evan explained quietly that every model in existence had been built on the assumption that its components met specification, and no model could ever warn against a lie that had already been accepted into the system as though it were the truth. Roderick demanded the test be shut down immediately and accused Evan of deliberately sabotaging a program worth billions of dollars simply to prove his own point. It was then that Arden finally stepped forward in front of the entire board, handing Celeste the recording of Roderick's order to keep the unverified sensors installed, along with a stack of emails detailing months of quietly altered safety reports. Roderick tried immediately to shift blame onto subordinates, insisting he had only ever been trying to keep the company on schedule during an unforgiving competitive market. Celeste, her expression hardening into something cold and final, suspended his authority on the spot in front of the entire assembled board. For one brief moment, it seemed as though the crisis had finally been contained, until a scheduled automated diagnostic cycle, set weeks earlier and long forgotten, suddenly triggered and began energizing the electrical system entirely on its own. The manual shutdown command from the control room failed to respond, and the Asterion prototype began climbing steadily in power output, with the faulty sensor still fully connected to the network. Evan did not rush toward the control panel the way everyone in the room instinctively expected him to. Instead, he turned calmly to the three engineers standing beside him and told them simply that this, right now, was the final examination, and that it was time to show him everything they had learned. No passengers sat aboard the grounded aircraft, but the danger was still severe in every practical sense, since a runaway battery failure could destroy a prototype worth hundreds of millions of dollars, erase years of accumulated engineering data, force an emergency evacuation of nearby technical staff, and potentially end the entire Asterion program before it ever truly began. Evan did not attempt to solve the crisis single-handedly, and instead assigned each engineer a role that matched exactly the strengths he had spent years quietly cultivating in each of them. Lena worked quickly to isolate the interconnected systems and prevent the developing fault from spreading further into the aircraft's core architecture. Marcus began reducing propulsion load in careful, deliberate increments, working to avoid triggering an automatic system lockout that would remove human control entirely. Jonah raced to restore an older, dormant verification layer. Buried deep within the legacy code, the very safeguard Roderick had quietly stripped away months earlier. Evan himself remained fixed on the incoming data stream, watching for the precise moment when a manual shutdown would actually succeed, rather than simply trigger another automated override. Because Roderick had previously removed direct engineer access from the primary controls in favor of full automation, the team was forced to route through an old maintenance channel that had never once been tested under conditions this extreme. Marcus voiced his fear openly, admitting that channel had no proven track record whatsoever under genuine high-load stress. Evan reminded them all of something he had taught inside the Fellowship many years earlier, that no one ever needed a perfect choice in a moment like this, only a choice that still left room to correct their mistakes afterward. The three engineers moved with remarkable precision under the pressure, each trusting the others completely, without needing to speak every step aloud. Lena successfully isolated the failing battery cluster from the rest of the aircraft's electrical network within moments. Marcus brought the engine's power output down steadily, avoiding the lockout that had threatened to strip away their remaining control entirely. Jonah managed to restore the dormant shutdown signal, but the legacy system demanded an authorization code belonging specifically to the system's original architect before it would accept the command. That code belonged to Evan alone, a remnant of the very safeguards he had designed years before anyone in that room had ever set foot inside the building. He entered it without hesitation, but rather than seizing control of the final shutdown for himself, he stepped back and allowed Jonah to complete the sequence exactly as trained. The rising temperature halted with only a handful of seconds to spare before crossing the threshold that would have caused irreversible structural damage to the aircraft. The room fell into a heavy, disbelieving silence as the system finally registered a safe and complete shutdown. None of the three engineers turned to celebrate or to thank Evan for guiding them through the crisis. Instead, exactly as he had trained them to do years earlier under very different circumstances, they immediately verified every reading twice, confirmed the safety of every nearby staff member, and only then allowed themselves a single collective breath of relief. Celeste, who had watched the entire sequence unfold from just a few feet away, understood in that moment that Evan had never simply taught these three people technical procedures. He had taught them how to remain calm under pressure, how to share responsibility honestly, and how to keep their own pride from ever standing in the way of genuine safety. Roderick attempted to slip quietly out of the building before the situation could be fully documented, but the company's legal department intervened, insisting he remain on site to assist with the mounting internal investigation. News of the near-catastrophic failure had not yet reached the public, since the board still hoped to manage the fallout quietly enough to protect the pending investment agreement. Celeste now faced an uncomfortable choice, whether to continue the same pattern of concealment Roderick had practiced for months, or to finally tell the full and uncomfortable truth to everyone involved. Evan made his own position unmistakably clear before the board could even begin deliberating on the matter. He announced plainly that he would not sign any confidentiality agreement if the company intended to describe what had just happened as nothing more than a minor technical hiccup. The board convened an emergency hearing only days later, and Roderick, still fighting to protect what remained of his position, argued that Evan had deliberately exaggerated the severity of the incident, purely to prove that his removal had been a mistake all along. He further claimed that the three specialists, given their obvious personal history with Evan, could not possibly offer objective testimony regarding what had actually occurred. Lena was the first to respond, presenting documentation that proved Evan's original warnings had existed for months before his removal, long before those warnings were quietly stripped from the official record. Marcus followed with the purchasing history, connecting the unverified sensor batch directly to a supplier financially tied to Roderick's own family. Jonah completed the technical case with a full history of the software modifications, proving conclusively that the safety layer Evan had originally designed had been deliberately disabled under direct authorization from the Chief Operating Officer's own office. Only after laying out every piece of technical evidence did the three of them finally acknowledge, openly and without hesitation, their personal connection to the North Star Fellowship in front of the entire board. They confirmed plainly that Evan had built the program from nothing, that he had personally evaluated their work during some of the hardest moments of their careers, and that the very methods now making them famous throughout the industry had originated entirely with him. They stressed that Evan had never once used that relationship to demand loyalty from any of them, and that he had specifically urged them to protect Harrington Aeronautics rather than resign in anger over how unfairly he had been treated. Roderick had replaced Evan with three people he assumed would be easier to control simply because their names carried more prestige than his own. Instead, those same three people now stood before the company's board, confirming without hesitation that everything they had achieved traced directly back to the man Roderick had so casually discarded. Arden submitted a complete archive of emails, proving that Roderick had concealed critical safety warnings, pressured engineers into altering official software documentation, approved unverified components sourced from his own family's business interests, ordered Evan's name quietly erased from the North Star sponsorship records, manipulated internal evaluations to make Evan appear obsolete, and accelerated the testing schedule specifically to protect a lucrative investment deal. The board voted unanimously to remove Roderick from his position and referred the entire matter to outside investigators for further review. Celeste stood before the same board and publicly accepted responsibility for approving Evan's removal without ever verifying the full body of evidence behind it. She offered to formally reinstate him to his former position, restore his lost salary, and issue a public apology acknowledging the mistake the company had made. Evan declined the offer to simply return to his old title exactly as it had been before. He explained that the real problem was never the loss of a single chair at a single desk, but rather a system that could quietly erase an engineer's warnings the moment those warnings became inconvenient for someone with more power. Rather than accepting reinstatement on the old terms, he proposed something entirely different to Celeste and the board. He would return only if the safety division was fully separated from the chief operating officer's authority, granted the standing power to halt any project without first seeking executive permission. The board approved a full restructuring of Harrington Aeronautics not long afterward, creating an entirely new position for Evan as chief architect of reliability and safety, answerable not to any single executive, but directly to an independent safety oversight committee. In this new role, Evan held the authority to halt any test the moment he identified genuine risk, to protect any employee who raised a legitimate safety concern from retaliation, and to demand independent review of any supplier relationship that raised even the slightest conflict of interest. Rather than positioning the three specialists beneath him as subordinates, Evan established a technical council of 4 equal voices, with Lena continuing to lead systems integration, Marcus overseeing propulsion reliability, and Jonah directing software safety architecture across the entire program. Evan took on responsibility for training the next generation of engineers, transforming the North Star Fellowship into a fully sponsored institution that remained operationally independent from the company that now funded it. Standing before the full staff of Harrington Aeronautics, Celeste openly acknowledged that the company had once dismissed Evan as a relic of an outdated era, while the very future they were now building rested entirely on the foundation he had quietly laid years before. Evan asked for no applause and no special recognition for himself. He asked only that the names of every technician, every tester, and every quality control employee be formally included in the record of the Asturian program's eventual success. 6 months later, the aircraft completed its full testing cycle without a single shortcut taken anywhere along the way, and the demonstration that followed proceeded exactly as it should have from the very beginning. At the public unveiling, several reporters tried to frame the entire story as one man single-handedly saving a doomed program from disaster. Evan firmly declined that version of events, insisting instead that it was Lena, Marcus, and Jonah who had truly saved the Asturian prototype, because they had learned how to trust one another completely under pressure. He added that the greatest achievement of any teacher was never making students permanently dependent on their guidance, but instead equipping them to make the right decision on their own, long after the teacher himself was no longer standing in the room. Maeve stood quietly near the back of the audience that day, holding the same chipped coffee mug her father had carried out of the building the day he was let go. On its side, she had carefully engraved a single new line for him to find later. The engraving simply read that North Star 1 was the man who taught the stars how to find their own way home. The story closed as Evan walked into the very first classroom of the newly independent fellowship, ready to begin teaching a fresh group of students. Lena, Marcus, and Jonah did not take their seats on any elevated stage as celebrated experts that day. They sat quietly among the newest students instead, ready to keep learning from the very man their own company had once believed could be so easily replaced.